Welcome to episode 33 of Leading People with me, Jerry Murray. This episode is brought to you by Wide Circle, helping you make better talent decisions. To learn more, visit widecircle.eu. That's widecircle.eu. Have you ever wondered, why do organizations need to invest in internal communications? What is internal communications anyway? And how do you get managers on board with your internal communications? These are just some of the questions I explore with this week's guest, author and internal communications expert, Liam Fitzpatrick. So, let's hear what Liam has to say. Liam Fitzpatrick, welcome to the show.
Hi there. Hi, thank you for having me.
So, Liam, we're doing this online as usual. You're coming into me from what is it, Northwest London, 10 o'clock between 10 and 11 o'clock on a clock dial phase.
Yeah, a little place called Rickmansworth, just on the outskirts of London.
Very good. Some of the listeners may know you, or have heard of you, or read your books. Others may not. So, for the benefit of all of us, perhaps we could just start with sort of a classic question is, how did you get here? Was there a person, place, or an event that stands out on your journey to where you are today? Or was there an epiphany moment or a series of special moments that sort of brought you into this world of internal communications? Because that's where we're heading today. We're going to also show how leading people is very related to how well we handle internal comms. So over to you, Liam.
Yeah, it's a good question, because there's definitely a moment I can look back to. I mean, around about the mid-1990s, I was working. My background was in mainstream PR, doing big rail projects, big engineering projects, doing PR for them. And the firm that I worked for had a contract with BT, and their contract was to try and introduce a new project management system to BT's research labs at a place called Martlesham Heath out in the middle of Suffolk. And what BT wanted to know was, how come our guys haven't invented the internet when we've got the brainiest, cleverest engineers? And they thought the solution to this problem would be to make them all follow project management procedures and take all the fun out of their job. And I got roped in by my colleagues who were project managers to say, well, can you do all the communications around it? So my job was to write these breathless newsletters telling all these really clever people how exciting it was going to be, that all the fun was going to go from their job. And I think I got to edition 3 of the newsletter to realise that not one soul was reading this turgid rubbish I was writing. And I thought, well, hang on, there's obviously some role for communications to play in changing the way people are at work, teaching them new systems and processes. And I realised I didn't know what it was, and I just became obsessed with it. And so I was very, very lucky. I then ended up working with people who also were interested in that question. And over the years, I've ended up working on change programs with people across a whole range of industries, from telecoms through to engineering to government, and in the UK, around the world, Saudi Arabia, Middle East, and North America, all over the place. And it's been a kind of quest to actually understand what's the role of communications in helping people change and adapt at work and live fulfilling employment lives. So that's my background, really.
And anybody who's got a job, it probably is quite interesting to them to contextualize that and understand it. And you mentioned the 1990s, and of course, I know there have been some institutes that have occupied themselves with the concept of internal communications. You probably weren't alone in coming in from the more external PR, public relations side into this field. At least you were bringing in some of the discipline from that area. It's probably fair to say that in the 1990s, the concept of internal communications, beyond producing a company newsletter, wasn't much, was it? It was still very much in its infancy. It was like, pump something out there. Usually it was a broadsheet of some sort, or some sort of magazine. show the folks that everybody else is happy and some people have done great things, tell them what's going on, and our job is done. That's how a lot of leaders thought, yeah? Did they not get the magazine last month? Why are they asking all these questions?
Yeah. And actually, I mean, when I first got roped in, I thought, oh, I don't want to do this, This is, internal comms was the job you gave to the useless bloke back in the day. Maybe I'm saying too much about myself there, but it was the job you gave to an old buffer, and they were at the end of their career. They'd lived, they'd done a great service to the organisation. They had another 4 or 5 years to go before retirement. You wanted to put them somewhere where they couldn't do any harm, so you stuck them in internal comms. And a lot of the internal comms people like I met in the early days were, people who just were really passionate about producing things like newsletters, collateral, great, lovely people. But actually, it was kind of big corporate did it because that's what you did, and it didn't. But no one really cared that much. And then when it came to the really meaty stuff, trade unions were still around to, that's what the people you had the conversations with. And by and large, it was kind of the backwater for most PR or comms careers was to go into internal comm. You do it because you needed a box to tick on your way up. But, God help you if you got stuck in internal comms back in the 80s and 90s. It was not, it was a bit of a graveyard for careers.
Yeah. And I mean, there was a view at the time as well. I mean, a lot of the people who, like you describe, were actually quite well networked in an organization because they'd been there quite a long time, been around. They knew how to go to lunch with the other managers, talk about stuff that needed to get talked about. And then they had the PR skills so they could turn some of that stuff into a product of some sort that went out. As you say, it was easy enough way to ease themselves out of those last years of a communications career, wasn't it, to be able to do that type of work?
Yeah, you weren't going to become a comms director working in internal comms, but actually they were this wealth of repository of insight into the organisation, which quite often the organisation just didn't appreciate what it had.
Yeah. Okay, so before we get to the books, right? Because you've written a couple of books, and there's one new edition just come out of one of the books, which you said before we came on is actually a total rewrite, but we're going to come to that in about 5 minutes or so, because I wanted to ask a question that may be on people's minds out there, going through their heads at the moment. So why should organizations invest in internal comms?
No one's ever asked me that question before.
Welcome to the show.
No, seriously, it's an amazing question, which actually I think is actually the fundamental question which I think people should ask themselves. And quite often, people who work in internal comms never ask. They sit there and they quite often we sit there and we don't go, hang on, why is the organisation paying me to do this and giving me access to a laptop and all this other tools and stuff? Where am I actually adding the value to? And it's really simple. And it's more acute than ever before right now because particularly in Europe, in the Northern Hemisphere, you've got this big shortage of committed and skilled labour, and you want to hold on to them. So if you don't hold on to your staff, it's going to cost you a fortune. If they don't collaborate, you're going to get beaten to the punch on any innovation. If they don't do the right thing, you're going to get hammered by customers, regulators, quality control people. As we've seen in the last couple of weeks, if you don't say the right thing to them, don't equip them to do the right thing, it's going to trash your reputation. And then no organisation is static at the moment, and there's change going on. And internal employee communications holds one of the biggest keys to all of those areas. If you don't get it right, you might as well just pack up and go home. You might as well tell your staff you don't care about them and sack them off. Because if you don't have great communications, telling them a consistent story about what you stand for, what you want them to do, then why bother having a business strategy? And I think one of the lessons we've learned from COVID is that actually you need reliable mechanisms for telling people stuff. You need pipe work, you need plumbing that gets the message out to people. But you also need people who can help you take whatever it is you need to say and turn that into something meaningful. Could be your business partner, And then last, but no means least, there are also people out there who are coming proactively in the organisation and saying, actually, this is how communication can help us develop new products, to help us develop into new markets, or help us cut costs or whatever, manage things that drive the business. So a communicator should hold the key to a lot of those dilemmas or problems that an organisation has.
Okay.
And you should pay us a lot of money.
Sorry, what's that?
And you should pay us a lot of money for it.
Yes, because you've just linked it to the performance of the business via the performance of the people, via the challenges of attracting and developing talented people, and making sure that the tools you have available to do it are fit for purpose, right?
Yeah, exactly. If you so at one level, you just need plumbing. You just need to tell people need to be told stuff will work. They need to be told, don't stick your finger in the electric socket. They need to be told, this is how you speak to customers. They need to be told, basic information. So you need an infrastructure to do that. You need someone who can help you translate your business problem, like, we're not, maybe we've got a customer service problem, maybe we've got a talent retention problem, maybe we've got a problem to do with quality. You need someone who's going to help you translate that and find the communications angle on your solution. And you're going to need someone who's going to turn around and explain to you why your staff are being crappy to customers, why your staff don't follow health and safety rules, why your staff don't do the things you need from them. Well, that's where we can add the value.
Okay. So based on that, then another question that you've probably never been asked before. How would you define internal communications?
That's a really important question, actually, because there are kind of 2 or 3 different ways into it. There's the piece that I do, which is about saying internal communications is a bridge. It bridges between an organisation and the people it wants to talk to. And that's about a process of making sure that everyone has a shared context, that we're all pointing in the right direction, but also making sure that the leaders in the organisation have a reliable intelligence source about what's really working out there in the organisation. What are people saying? It's a 2-way process, so you're a bridge between the 2 points. The other element to it is actually enabling people in the organisation to have great conversations, particularly managers. The bulk of great internal communications really relies on the role of leaders to translate corporate messages into something that makes sense on a day-to-day basis for their teams. And one of the key parts of internal communications is actually helping leaders have those conversations, providing them with the training, the coaching, the tools, and the insights they need to do that job properly. It's not, I should say, internal communications isn't about, the fact that person 2 desks away, you can't stand them and you only ever send them an email rather than actually talk to them. It's not about that kind of day-to-day intercourse between, regular colleagues. If people don't like each other at work, that's not my problem. I've walked away from that one a few times.
Okay, so we have this 2-way process, which because I think in the olden days it was a broadcast, like let's just get it out there, and you kind of had this expectation that people would somehow always read what was going out there. I mean, I was involved in a lot of internal comms work in both in-house and then in my first few years of running a business outside of big corporate as a consultancy, and there's been big conversations about whether the internal magazine should go to people's homes so the family could read the internal magazine, and then what sort of format should that take to attract teenage kids to read what their dad or mum was up to, and all sorts of stuff like that, which was very good. So this was the way some organizations thought. Sometimes you'd go and you'd say, does anybody read this stuff? If they do, what bits do they like? or you'd be thinking about launching a new version of the magazine. And I remember with one big multinational saying, well, why don't we ask the people? And this was a command and control organization, and the people around the table went white. They said, we can't do that. I said, why not? Management just want it. We have to tell the people what's going on. And you used to have these very interesting conversations about even just how to approach this thing. And so you had a lot of broadcast mentality. And after a while, today, in today's multimedia, multidimensional world of communication we live in, you can flick channels quite quickly with your remote control. You can scroll through your phone and click apps. So attention spans are probably a bit limited out there. So we need to adapt. Okay,
sorry, I could have just jump on that, because one of the things I still find exists in big corporates, you have a belief amongst many senior managers still today that a North Korean model of propaganda works. And if you just keep telling everyone that the sun shines and, shouting death to America occasionally, that'll, the workforce will troop happily into the sunset, with a firm jawed, punch to the capitalist, oppressor. A lot of corporations still think like that and still behave like that, despite the fact all the evidence to the contrary in their private lives.
That's right. I mean, I've even seen professors of communication saying that if you keep telling them often enough, the people will eventually get it, I mean, I was sat there thinking sometimes they're saying to managers, stand in front of a camera and deliver a message, even if it's not your message, just deliver it. It'll be convincing enough. The problem is the talk and the walk, if they're not congruent, creates all sorts of dissonance for the people in an organization, because you can put out as much of this stuff as you like, but if the leaders and managers do things that are completely opposite, it's very easy to see that. And that's the thing that maybe some people at leadership levels don't always appreciate, how easy it is to spot what leaders do.
Yeah, and the thing is that they move amongst us, and we see what they do. We see them, being crappy to the security staff. We see them nicking the best parking spaces in the car park. We see them pushing to the front in the canteen. Those are exaggerated examples. But if your leaders are giving you a load of BS, the workforce are going to spot it straight off. And it's not like not like you're a politician standing up in the Senate or in Parliament saying what you want. People know the truth. They know the truth of what you're like. So you can't get away with it.
Okay, so I know you wrote a book called Internal Communications: A Manual for Practitioners, but your most recent work, right, is a rewrite of a book, I think you said it was an update, but you said a complete rewrite, I think, of a book called Successful Employee Communications, which you've co-authored, right? So tell us about why you've written or rewritten this book, and what's in it for our listeners to go and get this book or read it. In the next part of our conversation, Liam explains why he's brought out a revised edition of his latest book, Successful Employee Communications, why the emphasis in the book is on tools, models and best practices rather than theories, and why middle managers play such an important role in internal communications. He also has some useful tips for how to help managers be better communicators. So, back to our conversation.
Yeah, so the book's called Successful Employee Communications, and we've subtitled it A Practitioner's Guide to Tools, Models and Best Practice for Internal Communication. And hey presto, that was half the word count done just in the title, so we thought we'd crack it all in. So I did it with my old friend and partner in crime, Sue Dewhurst. And so we wrote the first edition. It came out just 3 years ago. And obviously in the world of employee communications, the world has changed quite dramatically in the last 3 years for a whole variety of reasons. And we also realised that, when you write your first edition of a book, there's usually a bunch of things you wish you'd done better. So this time round, the focus very much of the book is around practical advice. It's not about loads and loads of theory. We explain some of the theory, we reflect on the most up-to-date academic thinking in a number of areas, and we reference the academic thinking where we've got it. But the bulk of the gist of the book is about saying, this is how you do it. These are things that other practitioners are doing. This is how they do it. So we've got over 40 case studies and expert opinions in there, which are really heavy on practical advice. So how do you go out and get information? How do you go out and structure your plan? How do you organise your team? So there's lots of meat in there. Ideally, you'll look at the book and you'll pick it up, and there'll be on every chapter there should be a bunch of things that you'll think, I can use some of that, or I can adapt it, and I can improve how we work in this organisation, or I know where to go and look for more. So it's not about a bunch of highfalutin theory. It's very much about the practicalities. And we've got case studies in there from organisations as diverse as Shell at one end through to small charities like there's a UK charity called Scope. We've got expert views from people who didn't necessarily want to talk about the name of their organisation, but wanted to share a tool or a tactic that they found very useful. There's one great case study in there about how do you do a very simple listening exercise so that you can get your CEO to think differently about comms. So there's a range of different things. And we put 2 new chapters in there. We put in a chapter about employee listening, and we put in a new chapter about the changing nature of work. And we beefed up quite a lot of the other chapters. So, for example, the chapter on purpose, there's been quite a lot of thinking that's appeared, academic thinking, in the last few years. So we kind of reflect that as well. So we've beefed it up a lot, and we managed to sort of go from about 250 pages to well over 300. It's a hefty book. If you at the price, it's kind of like it's there's a joke to be made about don't worry about the quality, just feel the weight of it. It's pretty good. So
very good. And I'm sure it weighs just as much when you put it on a Kindle as it does in your hands.
It's also about 2 centimeters thick. So if you've got a really wobbly desk, it's perfect for that as well. Yeah.
Okay, so let's 3 years out, and you bring out a new edition. So tell the listeners out there whether they're working in professional comms or not. I think this is important stuff because it's also about appreciating the value of having a professional communications team around you when you run an organization. How has the world of changed for internal comms in the last couple of years? And I guess the other question that goes with that is, there's been a lot of the pandemic created all sorts of new dynamics that weren't there, or let's say they might have been beneath the surface, but they weren't as visible. And so maybe even there's been a huge emphasis now on communicating, and it might be temporary, or it might be transient, or maybe it's going to create a new foundation for the future. But explain to us what's happened and how have things changed in the last couple of years.
Well, obviously the biggest one is that people aren't sitting in, office workers aren't sitting in offices anymore. And that's the biggest change. And so if you think about it, you go to an office, there's multiple different types of interactions you have with people around you. And through those interactions at your desk, at the coffee machine, in the corridor, in the car park, or whatever, in those interactions you learn about what the organisation is doing, what matters, who's up, who's down, what the culture is, what's valued, those sorts of things. Suddenly we rip that away and we stick people in front of a Teams screen, and we have this problem of actually, how do we make sure they stick around? Lots of people are going, hang on, I'm working 40 hours a week. I don't see anyone. I don't get much feedback, and I'm pretty skilled at this. And I can go up the road for another 10% more on my salary for another, and get another 40,000 euros a year, somewhere else. And they're off. They're not hanging around. So the big problem for corporations is, how do you bind people to them? How do you keep people bound in so they feel great about where they work, they feel great about the job they're doing, and have a sense of what they're meant to be doing as well? And that the burden of that falls massively on the shoulders of leaders and supervisors. You can pump as many emails out as you like. You can rewrite, intranets or whatever platform you're using. The bulk of that process of binding people to the organization is going to come through leaders. It's the one-on-one interaction that leaders are going to have with their team members. And it's going to be those interactions that team members are going to judge, that are going to tell them, do I stick around? Do I collaborate? Do I do the right thing? Do I say the right? It's going to be on the team leader. It's going to be on the supervisors and the leaders who are going to make the difference.
So, given that your book has over 40 case studies in it, were there some examples of how organizations had successfully adapted to this, and what sorts of things did they do? What were those practical things that they did or are in the process of continuing to do, which seem to be making a difference to this changing dynamic where the supervisor now becomes really critical to that whole communication process?
So I think it's, for a lot of people, it's a work in progress. A lot of people are still wrestling with it, and I think it will be a couple of years before we all agree on what looks like good practice and that sort of stuff. But I think essentially there are kind of 5 things you need to think about, really simple 5 things. First off, have you told supervisors and leaders it's their job to communicate? And I'm not being glib when I say that, because a lot of organisations never actually say it, never actually say you are meant to communicate, or today we need your help communicating X. We just don't do it. And so our first question, have we actually told them we want them to communicate in general and specifically? The secondly is, have we actually explained it to them? Every manager will have the experience where an email will turn up in their inbox saying, here's a PowerPoint deck, share it with your team. And any of you will be really lucky if those managers don't just hit forward and write more crap from head office on the email. It's just like, so have we given them something that they can relate to, that they can actually, draw on, and so that when a team member puts their hand up and says, excuse me, Jerry, what's this all about? They can bring something. They were not treating them like animated notice boards, which is what a lot of organisations do. So have you done some sort of briefing? You're taking them out of the business. You're giving them in-depth understanding of the issues, way beyond anything you're going to put in your rubbish PowerPoint pack. What kind of training are you giving them? Are you training them to have conversations? Are you teaching them how to deal with difficult topics? Are you teaching them listening skills? Not just how to do a PowerPoint presentation, or how to sound like Barack Obama or Nelson Mandela. Are you actually teaching them to talk? What kind of tools are you giving them? Are you giving them PowerPoint decks, or are you giving them really useful materials they can actually work with, be that videos or whatever? And then finally, and most importantly, is, do those managers feel that anyone's actually listening to them? So that when the teams come back to them and say, actually, I think that's a load of rubbish and we're not up for that, or we think that's a stupid idea, they don't have to soak up that pressure. They can actually pass it on, and someone in the organisation is going to go, yeah, we need to do something about that. Because being listened to is so close to being loved that most of us are happy with that. And I think making sure that managers feel listened to is crucial. And quite a few of the case studies in the book touch on different elements of those 5 things about being listened to, about briefing and those sorts of things. So it comes up time and again. The successful organisations are doing some of those things. What also comes up is that no one's doing all 5 of them perfectly. Most of us are imperfect, and we get some of it right, but some of it wrong. But the ones who are really successful tend to have the strength in listening. And the last couple of years have demonstrated the power of listening in organisations, I think, massively.
Okay. We'll get to the listening bit in a minute. One of the things that has emerged out of some of the other conversations I've been having, particularly when the theme of engagement comes up on that, is that there's a lot of talk out there about it's the manager's job. And if you look at studies even by Gallup on that, where they've looked at the role managers play in engagement, and if they're often responsible for a lot of the disengagement, but also if you look at managers, they're not very engaged themselves because they have managers, right? Yeah. And an awful lot of managers can feel very squeezed in the middle of an organization where they're often given a lot of tasks to deliver with results attached to, you have to get all this stuff done. Yeah. And and yet they're and your point about the feedback is great until they meet that sort of, well, it's your job to sort it out, not mine. When they put the feedback that goes up and then back comes down, what do we pay you for? That's your job. You and the poor manager's thinking, maybe it's a good idea not to bother with any of this stuff because it's just going to make my life, just going to end up with more stuff to do, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How would you talk to that, particularly if there's managers out there listening going, oh, these guys are going to go off and advise organizations and I'm going to have to do more work and all this. So what have you noticed over the years that helps a manager deal with these? These are 5 great tips, great questions, great things that need to be taken into account. But how would you reassure managers if you were creating this dynamic? How would you reassure them?
Yeah. So, because historically, I grew up in a world in which people rather sneeringly talked about the marzipan layer. They'd say, oh, yeah, we're doing okay, but you've got these middle managers. We have these brilliant strategies in the boardroom, but the reason they don't work is these stupid managers we've got working here. And, they resist everything. And actually, in most corporations, being a middle manager is not what it's cracked up to be. You spend your life, you're the meat in this sandwich, and you're the person who, on the one hand, you've got senior leaders who just invent new initiatives and chuck them down the pipe at you. And then you've got team members who just, bitch off back at you and go, well, this is a really stupid idea. And you, the manager, because you've taken a bump in salary, you're expected to soak that up. And no wonder organisations delude themselves when they think they would just pump stuff out and it's all going to happen. No wonder. And what increasingly I'm noticing, and this is my experience, and other people will have different experiences, is that senior leaders, CEOs in particular, are waking up very quickly to the fact that they are surrounded by people who are dedicated to not telling them the truth. I'll let you explain what I mean. If you think about it, most people don't tell their boss everything. You tell your boss maybe 70% what's going on, and your boss, probably she or he, maybe they tell their boss 70% of what's going on. And then, a couple of layers up, you do the maths. By the time you get up to, 3 or 4 levels in the organisation, the CEO is hearing 5% of everything. And every time they sit in a room, they're surrounded by the head of marketing and the head of operations who've got their version of the truth. And in the last few years, I've worked with 2 or 3 CEOs who are actually really smart at this. And they go, Liam, I want to know what's going on. I want someone who's going to reliably come and tell me on a regular basis what's really going on in the organisation as a whole. And I think that seems to be a trend that predated COVID. It predated, I think, progressively in the last 4 or 5 years, where I think leaders are actually saying, I want to know. And they also are a lot smarter now, I think, about the fact that if you don't have that middle management cadre with you, you really are in trouble. You cannot execute your strategy without getting these guys on board. And the number of times I've been roped into programs in the last few years where the focus has been exclusively on how do we sell this to the middle management cadre? How do we get them to really buy into it? How do we fire them up? Let's not worry about the posters and the kind of the skywriting aeroplanes and the kind of the amazing juggling elephants or whatever. Let's really nail it with management. So my experience, whether I have no scientific basis for saying that beyond my own feeble recollection, my experience is that the world is shifting and leaders have worked out that actually it's middle managers who are the key to getting them the results. And it's not just about massive incentives or bullying people or giving everyone complicated spreadsheets to fill in. It's about actually how do we get the managers to buy into this.
Yeah. And sometimes actually all this glitzy stuff actually makes a small problem a bigger problem, because people look at it and go, how much did that cost? When managers sitting there going, more stuff that we have to push out there. So that can often create challenges for the managers. And this idea of engaging with the managers, and this, I come back to something you mentioned earlier, which is this kind of two-way process. And you have a concept called listening leaders. And I guess if managers are just being told all the time, then they switch off as well. So tell us about listening leaders and what you've learned over the years and what you're seeing that seems to work better in organizations around listening.
Yeah. I very briefly tell a story. I mean, I had a few years ago, I worked for a company called Marconi that was going spectacularly broke. I joined them. When I joined them, they just burned their way through a cash mountain of about $3 billion and were in debt to a further $3 billion. So they burned their way through $6 billion in 18 months. I was a bit like that teenager. You know, you go to school on a Monday morning and everyone goes, "Oh, did you not go to the party on Saturday night? That was fantastic." And you go, "No, I was at home, you know, and doing my homework." And it was a bit like that. So I joined this organisation and it burnt through, and we crashed. We had 55,000 employees. And in the space of 18 months, we went from 55,000 to 15 as bits of the business were sold off, bits of the business were closed down. And it was really tough going. And then news got out that the chief executive was, when we restructured the debt, the chief executive was in line for a multi-million-pound bonus if he clawed back some or regained some of the value that had been lost to the shareholders. And I said, "Oh, you're going to get mugged if you go out there and start talking to people. They're going to stab you." And he said, "No, I'm not. I'm going to go and tell them. I'm going to go and tell them what we did." So he went and did these town hall meetings, and he'd stand up and he'd start talking about the business strategy. And it's one lead, sooner or later, someone would put their hand up and go, "Mike, can you tell us how wonderful you are?" And then another middle manager would put their hand up and go, Mike, surely you're more wonderful than that." And then eventually some beardy engineer would put his hand up and go, "Excuse me, Mike, can I just check something out here?" So I've had a pay rise for 3 years. Half my friends have lost their jobs, and you're going to get a £2 million bonus or a £20 million bonus. Can you just talk me through that? And he'd go, yeah, of course I'll talk you through it. But let me just say, it's not fair, it's not equitable. But let me tell you what I've got to do to get that bonus. And he talked them through it, and he said, and I wasn't going to be offered that bonus and go home to my wife and go, "I've just been offered £20 million. I'm not going to take it, though." He said, "But I've got to earn it, and if I earn it, these things will happen, and everyone benefits and stuff. But it's not fair, and I'm not telling you it's equitable." And he'd get asked the same question 3 or 4 times, and people would come out of those sessions and go, "It's not fair, it's not equitable, but fair play." He was willing to listen to our complaints about it. And you could see where he'd been in the company just by the scores on things like, or the pulse scores about things like people feeling they had a future in the business. People had an emotional reaction to him. And what he would do is he would just go out and talk to people, just go and chat to them. He'd be willing to take any type of crap they throw at him. And he'd just say he was pretty clear about what he was doing, why he was doing it. He didn't give anyone any BS about what he was trying to do and who he was. But he would also go, "Okay, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that." And he would go and act on things that people said. So one thing he did, we sent him out and he did a back to the floor exercise where he worked alongside some guys installing equipment in a client site. And the guys opened the boxes and they kept saying to him, "Look, Mike, every time these boxes come from the factory, half the stuff's not in them." And he'd go, "Okay." And he came back. Next day, he had a meeting and he said, "I just worked out why our customers aren't paying us, because the factory aren't sending the complete stock so we're not doing the installations. So we need to fix that." And the result was that employees saw that when they had a conversation with him, he would take it away and fix stuff. And it just, the morale in this company that went from 55,000 people to 15, the morale just went up. Yeah, fantastic. People were proud to work there again after 2-3 years of crap. And it was just his personal behaviour and his personal demeanour about just being willing to listen to people, just be present in a conversation.
Was he newly appointed then after the financial disaster, or had he been there during it?
Well, that was the interesting thing. He was a lifelong employee of the firm, and he'd been running the North American division and had witnessed the spend, because basically the business had gone gangbusters during the internet boom of the of the early kind of 2000s, and so people would be buying lots of telecoms equipment because that's what we made, the stuff that goes in telephone exchange. So, and you need that for, when you're having a gold rush, the people who make the money are the people who sell the pounds, not the. And so we were we were supplying that stuff. And he was the guy in North America going, I'm not too sure if this is going to last. And then when the crash came and the management team was kicked out by the board, he was brought back from the US. So he had this heritage in the business. So he actually kind of knew how the business worked. I think he'd actually been, he trained as an accountant in the business. He'd been there 20 odd years. So he kind of knew the people, knew the organisation. So he had that natural affinity.
But he didn't have the baggage of having led the demise, the financial demise of the organisation. He had been removed from that a little bit in his operations that he was running. Is that right?
Yeah, and the story did the rounds in the business that he'd been actually the guy who'd been the Cassandra almost, who'd been, saying, I think, guys, we need to calm down. And so the story went the rounds that he was the sensible guy. He was one of us. I think that's the thing that people like. He wasn't some flashy bloke who worked for a merchant bank in London. He was a guy who, he liked hanging out with engineers and talking about telecom stuff. But the point being is that he was able to have a listening conversation with people. He was able to actually sit down with them and invite them in. So I'm interested in what you've got to say. Tell me what. There's a brilliant book. I don't know if you've come across her. There's a British woman called Catherine Mannix. She's a doctor. And she wrote a couple of books. She specialises in palliative care. And she has very, very difficult conversations with patients all the time. And she wrote a brilliant book a few years ago called With the End in Mind, where she talks about the process you go through as a patient when you're facing the ultimate bad news. And she brought out a book last year called Listen, which is a book based on her experiences over the years, both working in palliative care and drawing on advice from other parts of the world. And it's full of really great advice on how you strike up a conversation with someone. A meaningful and curious conversation where you're actually willing to listen to what people have got to say and you're going to react on it. And I said earlier, I don't know who said it originally. I think I heard it attributed to John Lennon once, might have been someone else. And it was a phrase something like, being listened to is as close to love as many of us ever experience. And I think for corporations that don't invest time in listening, you're missing a massive trick. So teaching leaders to listen, helping them have curious conversations, not necessarily to be the guys who always got the answer. Sometimes that's all people want. They just don't want the answer. They quite often just want someone who's going to hear them.
So, Liam, and I think you have got some tips or 4 principles or building blocks for helping leaders develop their listening skills. What are those? Would you like to share those with our listeners, please?
Yeah, so typically when you get involved in training leaders, particularly around something like a crisis or a difficult announcement or whatever, or a change, the sorts of things I tend to talk about are do it often. You don't have to tell the whole conversation at once. Just do it often. Make time to do it. Do it little and often. Find ways of doing it often. So hang out, talk to people, find ways of straightening the conversation. Have senior leaders model that behaviour. So people do what the boss does. So if you've got a chief executive who's going around having chats with people, striking up conversations, and if you can find formats that work for your chief executive, because not everyone's got the same taste, find ways that the senior leaders can do that, be that big town hall meetings or small one-on-ones or back to the floor exercises or just small focus groups. But get leaders to model listening. Listen to the feedback and show you've listened to it. Tell people, you told us this, so we've done this. Don't be afraid to show the result. And don't wait 12 months after the staff survey when you're doing the next staff survey to go, oh, last year you told us about this. No one ever believes that. They know you're just trying to get them to answer it again. So find ways of just saying, we're hearing this, so we're thinking about doing that. And then the last thing is say to leaders, when we tell you something, when we ask you to communicate something, before you go and communicate, just tell us how your team are going to react to this. Tell us how you think this is going to go down with your team. It's a great technique. First off, it forces them to imagine what their team are thinking. And secondly, it also gives them a license to tell you if they think it's a rubbish idea, but they don't necessarily have to own that thought, but it gives them a chance to. So think about saying, what do your team think about this? What will they think? How will they react?
Right.
Get those four elements right, and you've got the beginnings of a communications flow flying around the place.
Yeah. I guess it's also important to point out that they don't have to say yes to everything they hear back as feedback. They might have to say sometimes, it's great what you say to me, I'm listening, and at the same time, I can tell you now that ain't going to fly. We will not be going there. I guess even if it's just showing the acknowledgement of somebody's suggestion, that helps a lot. At least the person felt heard, right?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things about the Catherine Mannix listen thing. She talks about having curious conversations. So asking questions with the intention of understanding without necessarily feeling obliged to come up with a solution. Sometimes, if you're a manager, you feel you've got to have the answers. But you know what? No one's going to blame you if occasionally you say, don't know the answer to that one. I don't know how we tackle that one. Let me think about it. Let me go away. Doesn't matter. People don't expect you to be some superhero. It's okay to occasionally just go, I don't know. Or, yeah, I think, and as you say, Jerry, you occasionally need to also, that enables you to have the courage occasionally to say, yeah, that's a great idea, but, maybe in 5 years' time, Or
there's somebody else in that meeting. Sometimes even as a trainer at the front of the room, to be successful, you have to be open to all questions. And sometimes you genuinely don't know the answer. And what I often find is that somebody in the room might know the answer to that question if you just put it back into the room and say, has anybody got a view on this? And even what those people might contribute help create an answer that is useful for the person who's asked the question, because sometimes there is no right answer to the question. There's many options and many answers, and sometimes a question is asked to invite more of a dialogue, more of a discussion than looking for that one answer. So leaders can take that as an opportunity, that questions, even the difficult ones or the apparent difficult ones, can be turned into constructive things, because people don't ask those questions unless there's something sitting underneath it.
Yeah, and groups have this way of self-regulating as well. I mean, I do loads and loads of focus groups. I love doing focus groups. And you find that sometimes you'll get someone in a focus group who's a monumental pain in the neck, and you just, you wish you had an ejector seat. You could, fire them off into space. And the group will if you just keep quiet and don't try and control it, the group very often will regulate, and they'll come up with the answer, and you don't have to know the answer. As you say, the group's right. The other thing as well is with the training, when I do training for manager skills, I always talk about why difficult questions actually are your friend, because very often an aggressive sounding question actually is only aggressive because it's challenging, and actually what underlying it is actually a really important thing someone wants to understand, and they're testing. Quite often people say, "Oh, didn't you try this last year?" Well, that's actually part of the understanding process. So welcome it. Don't be frightened of it, and then you can bridge to your key message afterwards. But actually, very often, aggressive sounding, difficult questions are the way you're completely opening up a subject.
And when you think of it, an aggressive-sounding question has quite a bit of emotion and energy in it, which tends to come from people's values, something that's important to them. So maybe they don't always express it in a calm way, but that's because it's actually something they need to express and they want to ask you about. And it's by understanding that underlying interest or underlying value that maybe helps you talk to that rather than a specific thing that they mention. Like maybe when they say, well, didn't we try that last year? What's really underneath that is, I want a bit more stability in my I want to be able to think ahead, and these things interrupt me and they make me anxious about the work I'm working on. And I actually worked on this for the last year, and now you're coming up with something new that may, mean that everything I've just done is now worthless. All those great things that often are the things that really matter to people out there. It's not that they don't like the new software. It's often that they feel invalidated because they've worked on something else, or they've learned how to use a different software, and now it's like all change. We found something new, and they're going, but I've just invested hours of my time trying to be good at something else. Or isn't that right?
Yeah. And there's a brilliant book by a woman called Hilary Scarlett, and it's called Neuroscience for...
I know Hilary.
Oh, well, it's I think anyone who works in comms should have this on their bookshelf, because what Hilary does is she takes most up-to-date thinking around neuroscience and how the brain works and how we interpret information, explains it in a really easy to understand way. I understand it, so it must be simple. And then she says, and this is how you as a communicator can use it in practice. And one of the things she talks about is cognitive bias, which is this the fact that our brains are hardwired in certain areas, like, what you've just described, the sunk costs paradox. I spent 10 years learning how to use this software, and you're going to bring in a new piece of software and it can't be any good. I'm going to resist. But actually, as someone who's working with leaders, actually encouraging them to say, well, look, dig in a little bit, find out what's going on here, understand what the emotion is. It's not a problem, your employees actually... We listen in emotionally, don't we? You give people information, and it's our emotional set that changes whether or not we understand it or not, or miss them. And I think, so Hilary Scarlett's book, fantastic read. Everyone should have a copy.
To end our conversation, we explore the impact that COVID and remote work has had on how we communicate at work, and the challenges this presents for team dynamics. I suppose the other topic that probably has a lot of internal communications professionals and their managers and leaders scratching their head is how do we recreate the team experience at work, given that there's so much remote working and so much of internal. It's like what they say about music. Music happens between the notes.
Okay,
it's like the communication a lot of the quality of communication is often that meta level. It's that, I had a great conversation with Liam. He said, what do you talk about? Well, we talk about loads of stuff, but it was a great conversation. I always enjoy spending time with him. It's those little gaps between the notes. So people working on Teams or Zoom cameras all day long, some of whom, like I have two daughters in their 20s, and they've had hardly any experience of office life. Right, because they only started their careers in the last 2 years, really. So for them, going back to the office is like going. Oh, you mean going to an office now? And what does that? How do we? They don't have any reference points, and there's a whole peer group like that who don't have lots of reference points for this. So any last thoughts on how to create this team experience? What you might be noticing? I know nobody has the answer yet. What are some of the things you're hearing on the grapevine about that?
I was frightened you were going to ask me that question, because I think if you ask me that question in 2 years' time, I think we'll have a better idea, because I think there's a lot of people going to try it and they're going to fall over, and there's a lot of people going to scuff their knees trying to work out the solution to this problem. And I heard someone say the other day, look, the trick's going to be around giving people a variety of interaction opportunities. And I thought this really struck me as quite interesting. They were saying, to your point about it's the silence between the notes that makes a difference. They said, in an office environment, you're going to have 7 or 8 different varieties of interaction in the course of the day. There's the meeting. There's the walk back down the corridor from the meeting, in which you say, what do you think of that? There's the bit by the coffee machine. There's the chat in the car. And their point was saying, well, if you're not going to get people back in the office full time or anything more than 2 or 3 days, you're going to have to find ways of using technology to replicate those multiple different interactions. At the moment, all we're doing is we're just sticking people in front of Teams screens, giving them 29 minutes per meeting and then bumping them into the next one, barely giving them enough time to get a cup of coffee, and wondering why, A, they're feeling disenchanted, and B, they're all leaving the organisation, and C, there's no collaboration or anything. So I think actually there were one or two case studies in the book where people talked about looking for different ways of just recreating that richness of team experience, from, the monthly pizza night through to the, the Monday morning conversation with the team, or the coffee break type thing, so that you're not going to get the right answer, but just willing to experiment and mix it up a bit. And managers haven't worked harder than ever before in communications, and they have in the last couple of years, because they've had to be in touch with people and zoom in. So yeah, I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's about a willingness to experiment.
Well, the answer probably certainly is not to leave it as it is, where these screen-based conversations become very transactional. And as you also say, you're jumping from one to the next. Now, I know some organizations have introduced buffer zones now because their people are just disorientated almost. It's like Star Trek. They arrive in a room and go, am I in the right room? And if there's somebody in the room you don't recognize, you might go, oh, I must be in the wrong meeting. I've had that experience myself. It was just somebody had been invited and I didn't know they were coming. It was all these interesting things happening. So it's how do you create interaction opportunities beyond the transaction of the work, isn't it? It's how do we create opportunities for people just to engage with each other and have a chat? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that to be honest, that's why humans like going to work with other humans, isn't it? It's about that interaction, and might as well be part of the matrix, really, if you're not going to have that kind of chance to chat to people and just to find out about what's going on in their lives, and or indeed what they're working on.
Okay, so the book Successful Employee Communications is out, available at all good bookstores, I guess. And how do people get in contact with you then, Liam? I'll put some links in the show notes, but what's the best way to connect in with you?
I always love hearing from people via LinkedIn, and I post a fair amount of stuff on there. Most of it's pointing at practical advice rather than, promotional stuff. So, yeah, follow me on LinkedIn, say hi when you follow me and let me know you're there. And that's great. I also tweet at Liam Fitz, but be warned, a large chunk of that's about cycling trivia. So if you do follow me on that, you need to be willing to listen to me whittering on about bikes.
Well, I've got a few listeners I know who are into whittering about bikes and fitness and stuff like that. Okay, well, Liam, it's been a great 45, 50 minutes or so chatting with you. And I really, on behalf of the listeners, I'd like to thank you for sharing your insights, your tips, and your wisdom with us all today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great to chat.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. You'll find details of what we covered in the show with links, etc. in the show notes. Please share your key takeaways from today's guest and let your friends and colleagues know about the podcast. Oh, and if there's a particular author or leading thinker you'd like me to interview, just get in touch and I'll do my best to get them on the show. This episode was brought to you by Wide Circle, helping you make better talent decisions. To learn more, visit widecircle.eu. That's WIDECIRCLE.eu. Until next time.